Regarding Men, Episode 26, Feminism Kills in Dayton and El Paso.
Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Janice Fiamingo, and I'm here with the inimitable Paul Elam of A Voice for Men and an Ear for Men, and the wonderful Tom Golden of Men Are Good. And we're talking about a sad, sobering subject today, which is mass shootings. Of course, we've just seen news coverage of two mass shootings over the weekend, one in El Paso. A young man, I think of 21 years old, who has killed at least 20, well, he's killed 20 people, and there are many more seriously injured. And also another then following, was it an actual copycat killing? Do we know that the one was inspired by the other? I'm not sure, but another one shortly after in Dayton, Ohio, another young man, I think of 27 years old, who killed 9 people in a nightclub area, including his sister, and who was himself killed by police. In the other case, the case of the El Paso shooter, it likely seems that he was intending to die at the scene, since many of these mass shootings tend to be mass shootings and suicides, but he didn't die at the scene, perhaps found himself unable to kill himself in the end. And so we've had an awful lot, of course, of coverage of these events, and we've heard a lot about the fact that these are two white men, and that white male rage, or white terrorism, as it's now come to be called, is widespread, and that it's the major problem that needs to be analyzed and denounced when it comes to these kinds of shootings. There have been all sorts of tweets about how white nationalism or white supremacism is on the rise and is the primary explanation for what we're seeing. We've had people talking about the manifesto of the El Paso shooting, showing that he was motivated by hatred of immigrants, that this is a characteristic of angry white men, and that Trump himself is responsible for this kind of violence because he has supposedly failed to denounce white nationalism, which he has denounced it on a number of occasions and has recently denounced it in relation to these shootings, but that's never enough for his critics, many of whom have been quick to blame him directly because of his supposedly divisive rhetoric, his dog whistling to white supremacism, and his encouragement of people to harbor this kind of hatred against immigrants and against non-whites. So we're hearing that over and over again, and I guess what we're going to talk about today is how relevant is white nationalism or white supremacism to these mass shootings, or to mass shootings in general. I've seen tweets saying that every single mass shooter in the history of the United States was a white Christian male. Every single one, some people have claimed, which of course is nonsense. But our mass shooters in general, white and male, should we be pointing the finger of blame at whiteness and its toxicity and its drive for power? Should we be pointing the blame at masculinity and the desire for power through gun violence? Certainly that's what the pundits on the mainstream news would have us believe. So I don't know, what do we want to start with here? So many different things to talk about.
There's a great deal to unpack here. And I mean, one of the first things that comes to my mind, of many things that comes to my mind, is that imagine, we know, for instance, that a lot of violent crime is disproportionate in neighborhoods of color. That's a fact. It's not an insult. But imagine if we tagged violent crime as a matter of blackness or brownness, the outrage that would ensue from that, rightfully so.
Rightfully so, exactly.
that would come from that if we did that. Of course, we don't hesitate at all to attribute whiteness with all forms of evil. What also strikes me about this, Janice and Tom, is the things that we're not talking about. And there's a long list of them. And for me, at the very top of that list is fatherlessness. If you look at Adam Lanza and Nicholas Cruz and so many, and I believe it's a safe bet, we'll find a lack of father involvement in the two recent shooters. That seems to be the pattern, the more discernible pattern. If you want to look at what is probable causes for pathology in people, it's certainly not skin color. But broken families and fatherlessness can be traced to a lot of pathology in young men. One of the primary things being that we know, as Tom has pointed out many, many times in these discussions, it is fathers that instill a sense of empathy in their children. It is the experience with the father's discipline, the father's forcing to see children through the eyes of someone other than themselves, to see the world that way through another person's eyes, that actually creates and forms the empathy that child will develop in life. And what do we note in shooters? Fatherless, and obviously a lack of empathy. If you can walk through a department store gunning people down, I think it's safe to say that there's a problem with the lack of empathy there. What's also notable about many of these, in the cases that I've looked at, is that you also have many of them somewhere on the autism spectrum, which is not to demonize autism, folks, but also a history of being bullied. And so what do we know? We're talking about people that have been marginalized, pushed to the sides, often treated poorly, didn't have parental guidance, father involvement for one reason or another. And this seems to be a recipe for disaster for some young men and the people around them. And yet all we seem to be capable of talking about is guns and skin color, right, and gender. And it's like, how many people have to die before we can have a real conversation about what is causing this problem? I'm very disheartened by what I've seen in the media. It's been awful. And of course, on social media, it's been a lot of white demonization. It's, white males are the evil of the world, and it feeds into the Mazie Hironos of the world and the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of the world, who want to see, Ilhan Omar, who has already said that we should be more terrified of white males than of ISIS. This is feeding their narrative. The media is doing it. They're complicit in it. And I think that they are compounding the problem.
Yeah. I agree 100% that the top of my list is fatherlessness. I mean, it's just so incredibly obvious, but I also agree that nobody's talking about it. Nobody's saying one word about fatherlessness as being a possible factor in this acting out. Because this is acting out. I mean, these guys are just acting out like crazy. And fatherlessness is at the top of the list for me. Next down the list is probably the sense that people don't give a shit about what boys feel. They don't care about what boys feel. In fact, you see a group of young men walking down the street, you try and avoid them. People will avoid them, much less talk about what's upsetting you now. So boys are growing up in an environment where no one really gives a crap about what they're feeling. In fact, they want to be avoided. And at the same time, what are they taught in school? They're taught that white males were the major problem of our whole culture. That you are the violent ones, that you are the ones that have caused this trouble. You have taken land away from the thises and that's, and you've done this and you've done that. And gosh, can you just imagine a young boy hearing that over and over and over again? He's got no dad at home. He's got no male teachers. He's got nothing. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? It would take a fairly mature young man to be able to not act out after years and years of that kind of pummeling, and it is pummeling, Paul and Janice. It's like pummeling. The educational system now is pummeling our young men. The more I hear stories about what's happening now in our educational system, the more it makes me want to throw up. It's just, how could we have gotten to this point? So that's another couple of things we don't hear about. You don't hear about fatherlessness. You don't hear about the emotional piece where boys' emotions are ignored. And you don't hear about the educational system teaching them that they're bad, something wrong with them.
Yeah.
They should be ashamed of themselves for being white.
You know, and if I wanted to grow white nationalism, if I wanted to grow bigots, if I wanted to grow hateful people, I would treat them just like we treat our boys.
Yeah,
that's exactly what I would do.
Yeah.
I would tell them they're bad. I would marginalize them. I would make them feel like outcasts. I would cast blame on them for all the ills of society. And then I could sit there and say, oh my God, why are all these young men turning to violence? There must be something inherently defective about them.
Yes, exactly.
And that's, to me, that's what we're seeing. I agree, there probably is a rise in white nationalism. There probably is. I know there's a rise in anti-Semitism. There's a rise in all kinds of hateful acting out going on. And it's no wonder when you demonize half the population and you leave them very few choices of where they fit. This is, I mean, we saw this with African-American community where the canaries in the coal mine, when we disenfranchised black fathers, when we destroyed the black family, young men went out and formed gangs.
Absolutely. And there was also a unified push by our academics to prove that blacks were inferior to whites. This went on for decades. So it's little wonder that blacks responded to that kind of thing in the same way that the boys are probably responding to their being demonized now. I mean, if you look back at some of that research that was done, it's just appalling, you know, what the researchers did to blacks. Just Barney.
Barney's got something to say about it, too.
He does. He feels very strongly about it, but we're going to shut him up right now.
Obviously, he does feel strongly about it.
He does indeed. And I agree. I've often thought that I find it surprising, actually, not that there are young men who act out, but that so many restrain themselves given the barrage of hatred that they encounter from, I don't know exactly how early it starts. I think it starts in primary school. It intensifies in high school when they're getting full-on feminist indoctrination at the same time that they are experiencing all the very powerful physical, biologically induced physical and emotional feelings, urges that come with entry into manhood. They're experiencing that, and they're being told that those feelings themselves are shameful, that they're harmful, that they, the young women in their classes can dress and behave in any way they want, and that's empowering and wonderful, but they're not supposed to respond to it in any way. And if they do, even just by looking or making comments, that's somehow contributing to a rape culture, and that they have to feel guilty about their sexualized violence towards women. Then if they do go on to university or college, they're getting an even greater level of this kind of indoctrination. To think that doesn't have an impact, if I wanted to create killers or angry men who want to kill themselves, which I think the suicidal impulse is very strong in these mass killers too. There's really no better way that you could do it. And I've often, I've watched, I remember there was a video a few years ago when Milo was the really big thing, and he was talking at various universities and he was being protested. And there was one, and I can't remember now where he was, but at an American university, and he had just started speaking, and a bunch of activists came in to disrupt the talk. And the camera panned over all of those who were there at Milo's talk, and they were mostly young white men. And they were sitting there while the speaker that they had brought in, that they'd been anticipating hearing, was disrupted in the most rude and, and they were being denounced as whatever, white supremacists, haters, bigots, contributors to oppression, etc. And they were sitting there quietly, with self-restraint, while these activists actually threatened and harassed Milo on stage, took over the stage, started haranguing the audience members and everything. And I just thought, it's remarkable, the level of self-restraint that they're all showing. And you can't expect that everybody is always going to be able to show that level of self-restraint. And at the end of that episode, the president of the university, instead of denouncing the activists who disrupted the talk and were horribly rude and provocative, etc., instead of denouncing them, he denounced Milo, and by extension everybody who wanted to hear what Milo had to say. And he actually made heroes out of those who had disrupted the talk implicitly. And you just can't keep on doing that and telling these young men that they don't belong anywhere, that all they can do is apologize for their existence, that they don't have a community, they don't have a role. Yes, if they have good, positive family reinforcement, maybe they can learn to not to take that in. But if they don't have that, I don't know what we expect them to do, how we expect them to respond. And if this were being done by young women of whatever color, if they were enacting this kind of violence, the discussions on the mainstream networks would be all about what is driving these women. They'd be bringing in all psychologists and sociologists who would have empathy for what are the common denominators in these young women's lives.
Patriarchy.
What, sorry?
Patriarchy.
Yeah, exactly. It would be because they were victims. And of course, we're against that. We don't want to say that these men are simply victims. We denounce their violence. But if we're serious about making sure that we do everything we can do in a society to prevent this kind of violence, then simply saying that white nationalism has to be denounced at every occasion and white maleness has to be called out for the violence-inducing thing that it is, to think that that's going to somehow help is just unbelievable. It's a perfect recipe for continued anger, continued alienation, and more violence. Yeah, and and the thing is too that it has almost nothing to do with what we're dealing with. One of the shooters that the mainstream commentators are very quiet about was a declared leftist, a committed socialist, a huge supporter of Elizabeth Warren. Are we going to say that Elizabeth Warren has to apologize for this killing? This is the Dayton.
She should be arrested.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's her fault.
Yeah, yeah, it's her fault. Should she have to wear sackcloth and ashes as a result of the fact that this guy was he was a socialist. He declared that. I mean, something's going on there that doesn't fit their narrative. He killed his sister, amongst the others. Who knows? Maybe there's a history of family abuse there. We don't know what it is, but it has nothing to do with Trump and Trump's supposedly divisive rhetoric. The other guy mainly seems to have had the El Paso shooter. Yes, he expressed anti-immigrant feelings, but his main concern seems to have been environmentalism. The reason he was anti-immigrant was that he wanted universal health care, he wanted greater environmental protections, he was anti-corporatist. And he felt that bringing in more and more people who would be dependent on government services was not the way to promote the universal health care that he was so in favor of, and was also going to be a problem for environmental protection. So, are we going to blame environmentalism for mass killing? Certainly environmentalism is anti-humanist. It's anti-human in general. So, and I'm not averse to talking about ideologies and how ideologies do produce hatred and do sanction violence in cases. But let's at least get our ideologies straight and see which ones are actually driving these people. There was a fascinating moment on a Canadian news station last night, a CTV. They brought in John Lott. You guys know who that is? He's a very interesting man. I don't know if you can even place him on a political spectrum. He's a gun rights advocate, I believe. He's written a book about saying more guns, less crime. He's done all sorts of studies of where gun violence is where there's a lot of gun violence in compared gun laws in different states, and found that in the states where there is the most anti-gun legislation, that also tends to be the places where there is the most gun violence. And anyway, he's a very interesting person, and he runs something called the Crime Prevention Research Center. So CTV brought him on, I'm sure by mistake, because he didn't fit their narrative at all. In fact, behind him, the camera quickly shifted so that they blocked out that part. He had a big sign saying bias against guns. And but you know, the interviewer wanted him to talk about white supremacism as the thing driving these guys. And he said in most cases, he said 70% of mass killings aren't ideological in that sense at all. Most of them are just people who feel deeply alienated from their society. They're planning to kill themselves, and they want to go out in a way that's going to bring them a lot of attention. A lot of it is copycat violence. This has to do with people who are just so deeply alienated that this seems to be their only option in life. So, we need to be able to talk honestly about whether ideology is a factor or not, and if it is, specifically what kind of ideology that justifies violence, and also to recognize that in most cases, ideology is not the issue at all.
I think one of the other things that we really unfortunately have to pay attention to is that the problem of not talking about this and talking about it the wrong way isn't just confined to the political left or to the sycophantic media that is out there right now. I was watching, of course, the news coverage of this was obsessive, and I watched a program who had Matt Gaetz on there. He's a congressman from Florida, and a couple of other conservative voices that I really appreciate in most cases. They discussed the shootings at length. The word father never came up. The impetus never came up. They never talked about how white males are being marginalized and criticized and blamed and shunned by community. They won't talk about any of this. And I don't know if it's ignorance or if it is fear, political fear, that if they take a stand about, God forbid that you say that white people deserve the same fair treatment as everybody else, because I guess that would be some sort of political suicide to make a statement like that. That's white nationalist talk. But we found ourselves in a society that has itself gagged about any honest discussion of these problems across the board. Nobody's talking about it. I mean, the closest I've ever seen in recent times was when President Trump said it's a dangerous time in America for young men.
Right.
And of course, he's an iconoclast, and he is not one to really bow to PC, but everybody else, nobody's talking about the problems.
And why is that, Paul?
Well, gynocentrism,
Yeah.
I think, has a huge play in it. One, for the gender part of it, and the other part is racial politics, or is obsessively wrong as gynocentrism is in this culture. We can't, the moment you criticize a black politician, you're a racist. If you support a white politician, you're a racist. And God forbid you support white people as a class at all. That's sacrilege, right, in the worst possible way. There's a lot of reasons for it, but I think the main reason for it is political cowardice on the right.
Yes.
absolute political cowardice. Matt Gaetz, these other people, these guys that we normally people like me support, and I do support them in a lot of ways politically, I don't do so without not acknowledging that they're all still cowards in their own way. They won't stand up and speak the truth to power. And we have a convoluted notion of what power is in this country too. It isn't speaking truth to power to criticize white people who are seen as powerful. That's not truth to power. Speaking truth to power is speaking truth to the political power about the narrative in this country. That's what takes courage.
Yes.
And we're severely lacking it. And I suppose, to be fair, we have to filter this all down to cowardice in the voting population, that we won't come out in force for somebody that will tell the truth. We'll go with the flow. That's why Trump polls so badly, when they know that a lot of people they poll are going to vote for Trump, just like they did. You know, they had Hillary winning by a massive landslide the day of the election.
Yep.
Because of all the polls they did. And what they figured out is that Trump voters won't tell you they're going to vote for Trump.
Right.
We live in a very sick society. It should not be any surprise that we're having tragedies like this. And as much as I hate to say it, I'm going to acknowledge something here that I think it's important to say. I carry a gun everywhere it's legal. I feel uncomfortable enough with the way the culture has developed that I want that protection. And I do think, as long as we're not going to have a government that's responsive to the real problems, as long as we don't have a media that's responsive to the real problems, and our public figures are not responsive to the real problems, one possible solution is an armed citizenry, where, you know, occasionally one of these guys starts shooting people, and every once in a while, if there happens to be somebody in the crowd with a gun, they take them out.
Yep.
Right.
And again, I'm not trying to say this to brag or to tout guns as an answer to our social problems, but we don't have anybody looking for answers to these social problems.
Right.
And so I think it only behooves us to take our self-defense into mind. I don't want to ever be in a situation like that without a weapon.
Understood.
Yeah. Well, and there was just a mass shooting in Toronto last night, I think, here in Canada, and we have extreme gun control laws in Canada to a ridiculous extent.
There was a mass shooting in Toronto last night?
Mm-hmm. Just heard it on the news. I don't have the details, but
anything about it.
And we have violence in Canada too. People, Alec Manassian, for example, took a van and mowed a bunch of people down in the van. That's what happens in Europe often. People will use vehicles as their weapon of choice. And how are you gonna prevent that? So to think that gun control itself is somehow going to be the answer is just flying in the face.
You look at cities in the United States, cities with the greatest amount of gun control also happen to be where the most gun violence is.
Chicago. Yeah. In fact, there was apparently a mass shooting in Chicago over the weekend, but the media didn't pick that one up.
Yeah. Well, there are mass shootings. Yeah, there are mass shootings in cities like Chicago every weekend.
Just about every weekend. That's exactly
every
right.
Every weekend, and the media says absolutely nothing about them. Couldn't care less. So yeah, the hypocrisy there. The lack of real concern over the problems in our society is it really is stunning. And we in general, of course, on this program, we are concerned with men and with men's position in society in general. And I just when I look at the outpouring of anger, and indeed, I don't see how you can call it anything but hatred that is there every day in the culture at large, not just on the news, it's certainly there, but just in, you pick up a newspaper, read editorials, go on social media. It's just, it's naked, it's unashamed, it's
open. It really is. It's amazing.
It is really amazing. And I mean, my Steve Brule was just emailed me an hour ago to say he'd had a horrible experience at a Starbucks. He's sitting in the Starbucks working on his computer. After he'd been there 15 minutes, a woman sitting next to him, an older woman about my age, said, "Can I help you?" He looked over and she said that he had been staring at her ever since he'd come in. She was very uncomfortable with it, she said, and she was going to call the police. Steve said he hadn't even looked at her, maybe glanced. He didn't know what she was talking about, but she insisted that he had been harassing her by looking at her and that she was going to call the police on him. He didn't know what to do. He thought he could get up and leave immediately, but he thought then she'd call the police and they would be searching for him and he'd have to explain why he'd left. But to stay was also in some way to further incriminate him in her eyes. And he thought, who are the police going to believe? How are the police going to respond if she calls them? Certainly they're going to take her claims seriously and they're going to want to interview him and investigate him in some way. And he felt that nobody would back him up and that although, you know, he might not be charged with anything ultimately, that he would have to endure this humiliating, demeaning, and terrifying experience of being forced to explain himself to the police on a woman's word. And that this is increasingly the experience of all men in our society, no matter what they do, no matter what choices they make in their personal lives, that even when you're sitting in a Starbucks working on your computer and minding your own business, your whole life can be turned upside down because a crazy woman who's been indoctrinated by feminist anger takes against you. I know that has nothing to do with the specific topic we're talking about, but it's part of the whole culture of men feeling that there's nothing they can do to make themselves safe, and that there is this incredible societal blaming of them and desire to have them punished, and that many men themselves, and this is the other thing Steve said, he feels like, you know, men are their own worst enemies, that men themselves will say, well, it's worth it so that women don't have to experience harassment and rape. Worth it. It's, you know, and then that is the attitude of many men on both the conservative side and on the left side, that women have suffered so much, and if men have to experience just a bit of what women have experienced, then it's all justified in some way. But it isn't. And to think that that some men are not going to respond with rage and despair in equal measure to that experience is just ridiculous. I don't know, you know, I don't have any answers, because it seems to me now the problem is so much, it's saturated in the culture, the anti-male animus. You can deny that it exists, but I don't see how any rational person can claim that it isn't there palpably. You just look at a newspaper, walk into a university classroom, anywhere, any subject, talk to a bunch of women on the street, find out their attitudes towards men being imprisoned for a variety of offenses, or men being shut out of their children's lives, or men being arrested in domestic violence cases, even though the violence is two-way. And you just find this incredible indifference to men's pain and suffering all across the board. And so the fact that there are some men acting out in these violent ways, I'm sure there are many other issues too going on. Personal issues,
it's worse than that, Janice. I mean, it's the, you know, believe the false accused. I mean, believe the victim.
Believe the victim.
It's automatic. It's automatic. It's crazy. Yeah. So of course, guys are living in a crazy place. Poor Steve, you know, really, really difficult spot.
Yeah.
And what Steve experienced is the result of 50 plus years now of feminist doctrine of absolutely hating men and boys, seeking to harm them, to marginalize them, seeking to punish them for imagined slights.
Yeah.
This is a half century of abuse that's going on. And what do we know when children are beaten? When they grow up, they figure out, when I get big, I can beat somebody too. That's how family dysfunction and violence is carried on. So I say all that to say this: feminism kills. It
Yes.
does. Anytime I mean, just the way we treated blacks in this culture for so long, we marginalized them. We created violent communities that way.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we're doing the same thing with men right now. And it's absolutely insane. I don't think Elizabeth Warren individually has blood on her hands, but I think the ideology of feminism and I think we're seeing chickens coming home to roost. I really believe that.
And it's all relational aggression. This is everything the feminists do in hating men is literally relational aggression. And scientists are starting to get a handle on what relational aggression is.
Mhm.
And they're seeing, that if you look at it, they did this one study in schools, and they found that the boys were aggressive, physically aggressive, X number of times. But they also found that the girls were relationally aggressive about the same amount of time. But no one does jack diddly to them for that relational aggression. But the boys are punished severely. And the same thing's happening in our culture. When the feminists use this relational aggression to hurt men, I mean, they do it intentionally to hurt. No one says boo, and we've got to stop that. We got to start calling them out for that crap, because that's crazy. It's just crazy.
All I could say is don't hold your breath. Well, you can. I think that could lead to problems, Tom.
A couple of problems. I've solved one of them. I did a video on relational aggression, and that made me feel better. We'll put the link
for
below.
you. Good.
We'll know that we're actually seeing a society start going in the right direction when people even know what relational aggression is.
Exactly.
Yes. Disney knows what it is.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say that is unconscious knowledge on Disney's part.
Maybe so, but they've now counted the numbers of times that the Disney cartoons show relational aggression.
I know it's really numerous.
Yeah, I think it was like 10 an hour or something like that. I forget exactly what it was. But yeah, it's a lot more prevalent than most people think. And it's just one more way that men and boys are marginalized and beaten up.
This stuff is not working for us very well.
No, and then we've got the 0.1% of boys who act out and do these mass shootings, And then the feminists take that and say, see, men and boys are bad.
I maybe it's my paranoia, but I often feel when something like this happens, that kind of glee, a gleeful, exhilarated joy comes over many of these ideologues. Oh, good. Now we can beat them even more with this example. Whoops, my cat is.
Is that Nandor?
That's Nandor. Nandor's
Nandor wasn't going to be outdone by Barney. No, I agree with you, Janice. I don't think anything makes people like David Futrell happier than mass murder. Yes. I really believe that. I think they roll in that like a pig in mud.
And you can watch them when it's a man of color, they get depressed. Oh, it's not a white man.
Or they don't talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. That too.
Talk about it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know it's and you can see that happening even with these two shootings. That the El Paso one is so much more popular because it does at least partially fit the narrative.
That's it. That's it.
The Dayton
Ever been driving when somebody on the road does something stupid and you end up next to them in the next lane and they're looking ahead and they just won't look at you? Just like, I will not look to the side no matter what because I just embarrass myself. That's the way social justice crowd looks after there's something that doesn't fit the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're just not going to, it's not going to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
And it's really tragic. This is causing people to die.
It really is.
Stopping us from developing interventions that might help. Mm-hmm. And starting with an overhaul in our family courts.
Yeah.
Get the rats out of our family court system and start looking at divorce as an opportunity to restructure a family instead of to settle grievances. And we might go a long way with this.
Mm-hmm.
And get fathers back in the home.
Yeah.
Even the government should pay fathers to be in the home. You know, it's like some of the countries in Eastern Europe. What are they doing? They're paying to have 3 children. You know, we can pay to have fathers in the home because that's going to save huge amounts of money. You know, in the long run. Jeez.
Significant reorientation is definitely needed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and then there's the other problem. We have a privatized prison industrial complex
Yeah, go on.
that feeds off of this dysfunction, and they don't want things changed.
Right.
So, like I said, meantime, I'm packing.
Big business.
Yeah.
Yeah, are we about there?
Well, I guess we should give out our awards.
Yeah, you know, the whole fatherlessness thing, I think, is the overriding piece that we've talked about today. And who is it that's really done the most with the fatherless issues? Who do you think?
Warren Farrell.
Warren Farrell.
Warren Farrell. So Warren gets the humanitarian award today.
Look for his book, The Boy Crisis. Can't say I agree with every word of it, but I tell you what, Warren nails what's happening with boys, what's hurting them. He absolutely slays it in that regard. And it would really help anyone to read this and arm themselves with the data about the importance of fathers in the lives of children.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Indeed.
good for him. Good for him.
And how about the PUTA?
Well,
Robert, go ahead.
we think that Beto O'Rourke should get the PUTA award. His comments immediately following the El Paso shooting, blaming Trump, saying all of the cliched, predictable things about how Trump is to blame, Trump is responsible because Trump has created a more racist America and Trump has encouraged white supremacism, etc. I just find that so incredibly, well, it's so obviously political pandering of the most despicable sort.
Yes.
And a way of avoiding an honest discussion about the problems in American society. It's just really outrageous.
So Beto the Beta, also known as Robert Francis O'Rourke, he gets the flying puta, and boy, I tell you what, and he speaks Spanish, so he knows what a puta is.
Take that, Robert.
Take it.
Are we good?
We're good.
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you all. And we'll hope to see you next week.
Take care. Stay safe.
All right. Indeed. Both of the above. We'll see you. Men are good.